The old courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its stone walls holding years of decisions that changed lives forever. Inside, the wooden benches were packed with people waiting for their turn before the judge. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. In the front row sat a skinny 15-year-old boy named Andra, drowning in a suit 2 sizes too big. His grandmother had insisted he wear it. "They need to see you as a good boy," she had whispered while straightening his collar that morning. The jacket shoulders hung past his own, making him look even smaller than he was. Andra's eyes stayed fixed on the floor tiles. He counted them over and over to keep his mind busy. 1, 2, 3, 4, anything to ignore the stares from the court officers who watched him like he might run. His case wasn't supposed to be anything special, just another kid from the east side accused of being at the wrong place when a corner store got robbed. But something else filled the courtroom with tension today. Something to do with the man sitting up high in the black robe. Judge Richard Blackwell. Everyone knew that name on the east side of town. Mothers warned their sons about him. "You get in trouble, you better pray you don't end up in Blackwell's courtroom," they'd say. He had sent more young black boys to juvenile detention than any judge in the county's history. The judge shuffled some papers, not bothering to look up. His reading glasses sat low on his nose as he reviewed Andrew's file with a frown that seemed permanent. Andrew's public defender, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, had spent exactly 7 minutes with him before court. "Just say yes, Your Honor, and no, Your Honor. Don't volunteer anything else," she had told him. "With your clean record, we're asking for community service. Don't worry." But when the judge finally looked up and fixed his cold gaze on Andra, worry was all the boy felt. "Stand up, young man," Judge Blackwell commanded, his voice echoing through the suddenly quiet room. Andra rose slowly, his legs shaky beneath him. His grandmother reached out to squeeze his arm, giving him what little strength she could. "I see this is your first time in my courtroom," the judge began, looking down at Andra like he was examining something distasteful. "Though I suspect it won't be your last." Andrew's defender started to speak. "Your Honor, my client has no prior." "I wasn't addressing you, counselor," the judge cut her off sharply. He turned his attention back to Andra. "I see too many young men like you come through here. No father at home, failing grades, hanging with the wrong crowd. You think the rules don't apply to you." Each word felt like a slap. Andra had never met this man before, yet somehow the judge had already decided who he was. The boy's hands curled into fists at his sides. His father wasn't around because he was dead. His grades had only dropped after his older brother went to prison 3 months ago. But the judge didn't know, or care about, any of that. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Judge Blackwell demanded. The public defender shot Andra a warning look, mouthing "just apologize" from her seat. But something shifted inside Andra at that moment. Maybe it was seeing his grandmother's tired face, or remembering his brother's voice on the prison phone last week. Maybe it was just being tired of being seen as nothing more than another statistic. He straightened his shoulders, letting the oversized suit jacket fall more naturally around his frame. "I wasn't there," he said clearly. "I didn't do what they're saying." The judge's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me." "I was at the library when that store got robbed. The security cameras there can prove it." The courtroom stirred with whispers. The judge banged his gavel once hard. "Young man, your attitude is not helping your case," he warned, his face darkening. "I've been doing this long enough to know." "You've been doing this long enough to be the real problem," Andra interrupted, his voice somehow steady despite his racing heart. "You're the killer, not me." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. "What did you just say?" Judge Blackwell whispered, his face suddenly drained of color. "You heard me," Andrew replied, meeting the judge's eyes. "You're the killer." The courtroom froze in shock as court officers moved toward the boy. His grandmother clutched her chest, while his defender stared at him in horror. But it was the judge's reaction that caught everyone's attention. His hand trembled as he removed his glasses, and for just a moment, something like fear flashed across his face. 6 months earlier, the summer sun beat down on Riverview Heights. The neighborhood had seen better days. Once proud homes now showed their age with peeling paint and sagging porches, but people still took care of what was theirs. Children played in sprinklers that leaked onto cracked sidewalks, and old folks sat in lawn chairs watching the world go by. Andrew walked home from school, his backpack heavy with books. Math competition medals clinked together inside his bag, small victories that made his mom smile on the hard days. He stopped at Mrs. Johnson's corner store for a cold drink, using money he'd earned helping neighbors with yard work. "How's that science project coming along?" Mrs. Johnson asked as she handed him his change. "Almost done. My teacher thinks I might win the district fair again this year." "That's my boy," she beamed. "Your mama must be proud." At home, the small apartment was empty. His mother wouldn't be back until after midnight. She cleaned office buildings downtown during the day and worked at the hospital cafeteria evenings. The schedule was killing her slowly, but the bills didn't pay themselves. Andrew set his books on the kitchen table and got to work. His dream of becoming an engineer felt distant some days, impossible on others. But tonight, lost in equations and designs, he could almost see the future he wanted. The door opened around 7. Not his mother, his older brother Ty. "Hey, little man," Ty said, tossing his keys on the counter. At 22, he'd become the man of the house after their father's absence. He worked construction jobs and took night classes at community college, determined to make something of himself despite the odds. "You eat yet?" Ty asked, already pulling out pots and pans. As they ate dinner, Andrew told T about the science fair and his chances for a scholarship if he kept his grades up. Ty listened, nodding, pride shining in his eyes. "You're going places, little brother. Just keep your head in those books." Later that night, Ty borrowed their mother's car to pick her up from work, something he did whenever possible to save her the long bus ride home. The call came at 11:37 p.m. "Handa? It's Mom." Her voice shook. "Ty's been arrested." The next few days blurred together. Ty had been pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer claimed he smelled something suspicious and searched the car, finding a small bag of pills under the passenger seat, pills that weren't Ty's. Their mother swore they must have belonged to a hospital co-worker she'd given a ride to earlier that week. But with Ty's skin color and the neighborhood they lived in, explanations didn't matter much. The public defender assigned to Ty's case barely looked up from her phone during their only meeting. "Take the plea," she advised. "With your clean record, you might get off with probation." But Judge Blackwell had other ideas. Andrew sat in the back of the courtroom on sentencing day, watching his brother stand tall in borrowed dress clothes. Their mother gripped Andrew's hand so tight it hurt. "The court cannot ignore the epidemic of drugs in our community," Judge Blackwell declared, looking not at T, but at the row of white reporters in the gallery. "We must send a message. 5 years, no chance of early release." Their mother fainted. Andrew caught her before she hit the floor, his eyes locked on his brother's back as officers led him away. Life changed after that. Their mother picked up a third job. Andrew's grades slipped as he took on more household responsibilities. The bright future that once seemed possible dimmed a little more each day. Visiting days at the prison became the center of their calendar. Every other Sunday, they'd take 3 buses to sit across from Tay for exactly 45 minutes. Each visit, he looked thinner, his eyes a little more hollow. "Keep your grades up," Ty would always say. "Don't worry about me." But during their 4th visit, something had changed. Ty leaned forward, his voice low. "Listen to me, Andrew. That judge, Blackwell, he's got history with our family. Dad used to talk about him before everything happened." "What kind of history?" Andrew asked. Tay glanced at the guards. "Can't say much here. But Grandma has some old papers in that trunk of hers. News clippings Dad saved. You need to look at them." That night, while his mother worked, Andrew pulled out the ancient trunk from his grandmother's closet. Buried beneath old photos and faded clothes, he found a manila envelope. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, all featuring a younger Judge Blackwell from his days as district attorney. And there, in one photo, was his father being led away in handcuffs. The headline read, "DA Blackwell secures conviction in controversial case." Andrew's hands trembled as the pieces started falling into place. Rain tapped against the windows of the public defender's office. Lawyer Tanya Wilson sat surrounded by towering stacks of folders, her desk lamp the only light in the room. It was nearly midnight. The building had emptied hours ago, but she couldn't go home. not with Andrew's words still ringing in her ears. "You're the killer." Those 3 words had caused more chaos than anything she'd witnessed in her 8 years of practice. The judge had immediately cleared the courtroom. The bailiffs had taken Andrew back to holding. His grandmother had nearly collapsed. Tanya rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her coffee mug, finding it empty for the 3rd time that night. She wasn't supposed to care this much. Public defenders couldn't afford to, not with caseloads that could bury them alive. Most days, success meant just keeping her head above water, negotiating slightly better deals for clients who were already drowning in a system built to sink them. But Andrew was different. Something in his eyes when he stood up to Judge Blackwell. It wasn't recklessness or teenage rebellion. It was certainty. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. "Drop the case. I've reassigned it. This isn't worth your career." Tanya put the phone face down without responding. Too late. She was already deep in case files sprawled across her desk, every ruling Judge Blackwell had made in the past 5 years. The pattern was disturbing. Young black and brown boys consistently received the harshest sentences possible, while white teenagers with similar charges got probation, community service, or diversion programs. She'd pulled out another folder, her notes from her meeting with Andrew earlier that day. "Why did you say that to the judge?" she had asked him in the juvenile detention center visiting room. Andrew had just looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because it's true. You can't just accuse a judge of being a killer without explaining what you mean," she had pressed him. "The truth is right there where anybody can see it," he had said, his voice quiet but firm. "People just don't want to look." The boy refused to say more, no matter how she pushed. Tanya stood up and stretched her aching back. The wall behind her desk was covered with a corkboard where she had pinned newspaper clippings, statistics, and photos of Judge Blackwell at various community events. In the dim light, the judge's face stared back at her from different angles, his expression always the same, stern, sure of himself, untouchable. Her desk phone rang, startling her. Nobody called the office line this late. "Public Defender's Office, this is Tanya," she answered cautiously. Heavy breathing came from the other end. Then a raspy voice, disguised or perhaps very old. "Stop digging into Blackwell if you know what's good for you." The line went dead. Tanya slowly put the receiver down, her hand trembling slightly. She'd struck a nerve somewhere, and threats only came when there was something to hide. She opened her laptop and began searching news archives for anything about Judge Blackwell before he took the bench. Hours passed as she pieced together his history law school, then prosecutor's office, then a rapid rise to become the youngest district attorney in the county 20 years ago. A small headline from 22 years back caught her eye. DA Blackwell secures murder conviction in Jones case. The grainy photo showed a younger Blackwell standing on the courthouse steps, smiling triumphantly. Next to him was a caption naming the convicted man, Michael Carter. Tanya's heart suddenly raced. Carter. Andrew's last name was Carter. She dug deeper, searching for connections. Birth records, old addresses, family trees. At 3 a.m., she found it. A marriage certificate listing Michael Carter and Lisa Williams, who later gave birth to a son named Andrew. Judge Blackwell had prosecuted Andrew's father. The next morning, Tanya rushed to the county records office as soon as it opened. The clerk, an older woman with a kind face, recognized her. "Back again, counselor? You've been spending more time here than me lately." "I need the complete transcript from the State versus Michael Carter, 2003. The clerk's smile faded. "That's sealed by court order." "What? Why would a 20-year-old murder case be sealed?" Rain tapped against the windows of the public defender's office. Lawyer Tanya Wilson sat surrounded by towering stacks of folders, her desk lamp the only light in the room. It was nearly midnight. The building had emptied hours ago, but she couldn't go home. Not with Andrew's words still ringing in her ears. "You're the killer." Those 3 words had caused more chaos than anything she'd witnessed in her 8 years of practice. The judge had immediately cleared the courtroom. The bailiffs had taken Andrew back to holding. His grandmother had nearly collapsed. Tanya rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her coffee mug, finding it empty for the 3rd time that night. She wasn't supposed to care this much. Public defenders couldn't afford to, not with caseloads that could bury them alive. Most days, success meant just keeping her head above water, negotiating slightly better deals for clients who were already drowning in a system built to sink them. But Andrew was different. Something in his eyes when he stood up to Judge Blackwell. It wasn't recklessness or teenage rebellion. It was certainty. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. "Drop the case. I've reassigned it. This isn't worth your career." Tanya put the phone face down without responding. Too late. She was already deep in case files sprawled across her desk, every ruling Judge Blackwell had made in the past 5 years. The pattern was disturbing. Young black and brown boys consistently received the harshest sentences possible, while white teenagers with similar charges got probation, community service, or diversion programs. She pulled out another folder, her notes from her meeting with Andrew earlier that day. "Why did you say that to the judge?" She had asked him in the juvenile detention center visiting room. Andrew had just looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because it's true. You can't just accuse a judge of being a killer without explaining what you mean," she had pressed him. "The truth is right there where anybody can see it," he had said, his voice quiet but firm. "People just don't want to look." The boy refused to say more, no matter how she pushed. Tanya stood up and stretched her aching back. The wall behind her desk was covered with a corkboard where she had pinned newspaper clippings, statistics, and photos of Judge Blackwell at various community events. In the dim light, the judge's face stared back at her from different angles, his expression always the same, stern, sure of himself, untouchable. Her desk phone rang, startling her. Nobody called the office line this late. "Public Defender's Office, this is Tanya," she answered cautiously. Heavy breathing came from the other end. Then a raspy voice, disguised or perhaps very old. "Stop digging into Blackwell if you know what's good for you." The line went dead. Tanya slowly put the receiver down, her hand trembling slightly. She'd struck a nerve somewhere, and threats only came when there was something to hide. She opened her laptop and began searching news archives for anything about Judge Blackwell before he took the bench. Hours passed as she pieced together his history, law school, then prosecutor's office, then a rapid rise to become the youngest district attorney in the county 20 years ago. A small headline from 22 years back caught her eye. DA Blackwell secures murder conviction in Jones case. The grainy photo showed a younger Blackwell standing on the courthouse steps, smiling triumphantly. Next to him was a caption naming the convicted man, Michael Carter. Tanya's heart suddenly raced. Carter. Andrew's last name was Carter. She dug deeper, searching for connections. Birth records, old addresses, family trees. At 3 a.m., she found it. A marriage certificate listing Michael Carter and Lisa Williams, who later gave birth to a son named Andrew. Judge Blackwell had prosecuted Andrew's father. The next morning, Tanya rushed to the county records office as soon as it opened. The clerk, an older woman with a kind face, recognized her. "Back again, counselor? You've been spending more time here than me lately." "I need the complete transcript from the State versus Michael Carter, 2003. The clerk's smile faded. "That's sealed by court order." "What? Why would a 20-year-old murder case be sealed?" The woman leaned forward, lowering her voice. "All I know is Judge Blackwell himself ordered it sealed 5 years ago. Said it contained procedural errors that might confuse the public." Tanya's pulse quickened. "I need to see Michael Carter's prison records then." 30 minutes later, she stared at the file in shock. Michael Carter had died in prison under unclear circumstances just 3 years into his sentence. The official report called it a prison fight, but the medical examiner's notes mentioned injuries inconsistent with reported events. As Tanya left the records office, her phone rang. It was Andrew's grandmother. "You need to come quick," the old woman's voice trembled. "Andrew says there's something he needs to show you. Something his father hid for him before they took him away." The old house creaked as if telling its own stories. Andrew's grandmother sat in her worn armchair, hands folded in her lap, watching Tanya with eyes that had seen too much. Outside, rain continued to fall, drops racing down the windows like tears. "I should have told him sooner," Grandma Carter said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how do you tell a child such things?" Andrew brought a shoebox from the bedroom and placed it on the coffee table. The cardboard was soft at the edges from years of handling. When he opened the lid, Tanya caught the smell of old paper and fading ink. "Dad gave this to Grandma right before they took him away," Andrew explained. "He made her promise to keep it safe until I was old enough to understand." Inside the box lay a collection of items that told a story piece by piece: handwritten letters, court documents with sections highlighted in yellow, photographs paper-clipped together, and an old cassette tape. "I found this the night after they took T to prison," Andrew said, picking up the tape. "There's a player in Grandma's radio." The tape hissed and crackled when he pressed play. A man's voice, deep and clear despite the poor recording quality, filled the room. "My name is Michael Carter. If you're listening to this, I'm probably dead or still locked up. This is for my son." Tanya watched Andrew's face as he heard his father's voice, perhaps for the first time in his memory. The boy's expression remained steady, but his eyes shone with unshed tears. "District Attorney Richard Blackwell is building a case against me for a murder I didn't commit. He knows I'm innocent. He has evidence that proves it, witness statements, camera footage from across the street, the real killer's confession. But he's hiding it all." Grandma Carter nodded slowly as the voice continued. "Blackwell wants to be a judge someday. He needs a big conviction to make the newspapers. I'm just a stepping stone for him. But I found something out, something about Blackwell and Judge Wilson." The tape went silent for a moment, just the sound of breathing. "They've been fixing cases for years, sending innocent people to prison while letting the real criminals walk. It's all about money. The private prison gets paid for every person behind bars. Judge Wilson owns stock in the company. Blackwell gets campaign donations. And people like me disappear." Tanya's hands trembled as she sorted through the court documents. Sure enough, they showed gaps in evidence logs, witness statements that contradicted the official record, and judges' orders that seemed to deliberately block the defense at every turn. "Why didn't your father's lawyer use any of this?" she asked. "Court appointed," Grandma Carter said with a bitter smile. "Spent all of 15 minutes with my son before trial." One photograph showed a younger Blackwell shaking hands with a heavyset man in an expensive suit outside a restaurant. Written on the back in faded pen, "Blackwell and Prison Corp CEO Henderson, April 14, 2003, 3 days before Dad's arrest." "How did your father get all this?" Tanya asked, amazed at the detailed collection. "My husband worked maintenance at the courthouse for 20 years, Grandma Carter explained. People talk like you're invisible when you're changing light bulbs or fixing toilets. And sometimes they leave things on their desks when they step out." Andrew picked up a newspaper clipping. 4 months after Dad went to prison, Blackwell announced he was running for judge. His campaign slogan was "Tough on crime, safe communities." "And 6 months after that, my son was dead," Grandma Carter said, her voice flat with old grief. "Prison fight, they called it. But Michael never fought a day in his life." Tanya stared at a court transcript where key testimony had been redacted. The pieces were coming together into a picture too terrible to ignore. "Judge Blackwell didn't just send your father to prison," she said slowly. "By hiding evidence that would have freed him. He killed him," Andrew finished, just as sure as if he used a gun. The rain drummed harder on the roof as they sat in silence, the magnitude of what they'd uncovered settling over them. "What happens now?" Andrew finally asked. Tanya had gathered the documents carefully, her lawyer's mind already building a case. "Now we find out if the system that buried this truth can be forced to face it." As they packed the evidence, Tanya's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down and froze. "What's wrong?" Andrew asked. She turned the phone so he could see. It was from an unknown number. The father. The courthouse lobby buzzed with whispers when Tanya walked in. People stared, then quickly looked away. Even other lawyers, folks she'd chatted with every day for years, suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. "They're scared." Andrew's grandmother had told her that morning. "Fear spreads faster than truth in this town." Tanya clutched her worn leather briefcase tighter, feeling the weight of Michael Carter's evidence inside. 3 days had passed since they found the shoebox. 3 days of late nights piecing together the story, making copies, and hiding the originals where they couldn't be destroyed. 3 days of cars parked across from her apartment following her to work, then vanishing when she tried to get a photo of the license plate. The elevator doors opened and her boss stepped out, frowning when he spotted her. My office. Now. Inside his cramped office, beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick, he didn't offer her a seat. I told you to drop this case, he said, voiced low but sharp. Did Judge Blackwell ask you to tell me that? Tanya asked. The color drained from his face. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just about one judge. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, she replied, pulling out a copy of the evidence she'd organized. Blackwell buried evidence that would have freed Michael Carter. Then Carter died in prison under suspicious circumstances. Her boss glanced at the door, then the windows before responding. And you think you're the first person to discover this? 3 other lawyers tried to bring this forward over the years. One was disbarred for fabricating evidence. One lost his home in a mysterious fire. The third left town suddenly and hasn't been heard from since. A chill ran through Tanya's body, but she stood her ground. So we just let it go. Let a corrupt judge keep sending innocent people to prison. I'm saying be smart about this, he hissed. The DA's office has already requested that Andrew's case be moved to adult court. They're adding charges of contempt and threatening a judge. They want to make an example of him. They can't do that. He's 15 with no record. They can and they will. Blackwell has already signed off on it, claiming a conflict of interest that prevents him from hearing the case himself. Judge Wilson takes over tomorrow. Wilson? The same Judge Wilson mentioned in Michael Carter's recording? Her boss looked genuinely puzzled. What recording? Before she could answer, her phone vibrated. A text from Andrew's grandmother. They took him. Police came to school. Tanya grabbed her things and rushed toward the door. Where are you going? Her boss called after her. To do my job. The juvenile detention center was a gray block building with narrow windows and a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Inside, the smell of industrial cleaner couldn't hide the underlying sense of fear and despair. The intake officer, a heavy man with tired eyes, shook his head when she asked for Andra. Not here. They took him to county. County? That's for adults? He's 15. The man shrugged. Judge signed the transfer papers this morning. Emergency hearing due to the severity of the threat. Tanya drove to the county jail, breaking speed limits all the way. At the front desk, they made her wait 2 hours before telling her that Andrew couldn't have visitors until processing was complete. I'm his lawyer, she insisted. Then file the proper motions, the clerk said without looking up. Judge Wilson's orders. Outside in the parking lot, Tanya called every reporter she knew. None answered. She tried the State Bar Association, the ACLU, anyone who might listen. Voicemails, email autoresponders, secretaries promising someone would get back to her. As night fell, she sat in her car feeling the walls closing in. The system was protecting itself just like it had for decades. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Miss Wilson? A young woman's voice, nervous. I'm calling from the county records office. We've never met, but I heard what happened. Everyone's talking about it. What do you want? I believe you. About Judge Blackwell, I mean. He did something similar to my uncle years ago. And I want to help. How? Tanya asked, barely daring to hope. I have access to sealed records, including some that Judge Wilson doesn't know I can see. And there's something you need to know. They've scheduled Andrew's hearing for tomorrow morning. They're trying to rush it through before anyone notices. Can you get me those records? A pause. Meet me in the parking garage, lowest level. 20 minutes. As Tanya started her car, she didn't notice the dark sedan that pulled out to follow her. But this time, they weren't just watching. The rain had finally stopped, but puddles still dotted the parking garage's lowest level. Tanya's footsteps echoed as she walked, keys clutched between her fingers like a weapon. Her heart pounded against her ribs. A young woman stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. She wore the navy blazer of the county records office, her employee badge still hanging around her neck. I'm Lena, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. We don't have much time. She handed over a thick manila envelope. Everything I could find on the connection between Judges Blackwell and Wilson. bank records showing payments through shell companies, private emails, vacation photos of them with prison executives. "How did you get all this?" Tanya asked, stunned. "My job gives me access to digitize old records. I've been collecting evidence for years, ever since they sent my uncle away for something he didn't do." Her eyes hardened. "I was just waiting for someone brave enough to use it." As they talked, neither noticed the security camera above them slowly turning in their direction. By morning, photos of Tanya meeting Lena were splashed across the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, "Public DFNDR ACCUO of what in the SSTAMPRN." The article quoted anonymous sources claiming Tanya was bribing county employees to fabricate evidence against respected Judge Blackwell. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a small paragraph mentioning that Andrew's hearing had been moved up and was happening that very morning. Tanya rushed to the courthouse, only to find armed guards blocking the entrance. "There's a restraining order against you," one said, showing her a document. "Judge Wilson signed it an hour ago. You can't come within 500 feet of this building." "That's impossible. I'm Andrew's lawyer. He's a minor facing an adult hearing." The guard looked almost apologetic. "They've appointed him a new attorney." Through the glass doors, Tanya could see Andrew being led in handcuffs toward the courtroom, a stranger in an expensive suit walking beside him. Their eyes met briefly before he disappeared around a corner. Back in her car, Tanya called every news outlet again. This time, someone picked up. "Daily Chronicle. This is Ray." "Ray, it's Tanya Wilson. I've been trying to reach someone for days about." "The Blackwell story?" "Yeah, I've heard rumors." His voice dropped. "Look, nobody here will touch it. The paper's owner plays golf with Blackwell every Sunday. So that's it. Nobody will report the truth." There was a long pause. "I didn't say that. My cousin runs a blog. Small following, but growing. She's been covering corruption stories the paper won't print." 20 minutes later, Tanya sat in a coffee shop with Dana, a woman with bright eyes and a laptop covered in stickers. As Tanya shared the evidence, Dana typed furiously, stopping occasionally to ask questions. "I can have this up within the hour," she said finally. "But it won't reach enough people fast enough to help Andra." "What if we did more than just post it?" Tanya asked, an idea forming. By noon, copies of Dana's article had been printed as flyers and distributed throughout downtown. QR codes led to digital copies of the evidence. Tanya's law school friends helped spread the story on social media. People began gathering outside the courthouse, their numbers growing as word spread. Inside, unaware of what was happening, Judge Wilson prepared to sentence Andra. The boy sat silently, the court-appointed lawyer beside him having already advised him to plead guilty to all charges to avoid maximum penalties. "Before I pronounce sentence," Judge Wilson said, "does the defendant have anything to say?" Andra stood slowly. "Only that the truth always finds a way out." The judge frowned, about to respond when his clerk rushed in, whispering urgently in his ear. The judge's face paled as he looked at a phone screen the clerk held out. Outside, the crowd had swelled to hundreds. News vans from neighboring counties had arrived. People held signs with Andrew's face and the words "Justice DLAED" as "Justice DENID." Ty's former cellmates had spread the word in their communities. Andrew's teachers and classmates had come straight from school. Among them stood Lena from County Records, now surrounded by a dozen co-workers wearing their navy blazers like a uniform of resistance. And at the front, leading chants with a megaphone borrowed from a union organizer, stood Andrew's grandmother. Her voice, strengthened by decades of surviving injustice, carried over the crowd. "What do we want?" "Truth." "When do we want it?" "Now." Inside, Judge Wilson called a sudden recess and disappeared into his chambers. Through the courtroom windows, Andrew could see the gathering crowd. For the first time in months, he smiled. 2 weeks later, the state courthouse looked different. News vans lined the street. People filled every seat in the large hearing room, with hundreds more waiting outside. National reporters scribbled notes as the special investigator appointed by the governor called the hearing to order. Andrew sat beside Tanya, wearing a clean button-up shirt his grandmother had ironed that morning. He looked older somehow, as if the past weeks had added years to his life. But there was something else in his eyes now, not just determination, but hope. His brother Ty sat in the front row, released on bail pending review of his case. Behind them sat Lena from County Records, Dana the blogger, and dozens of others who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. On the other side of the room, Judge Blackwell stared straight ahead, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Judge Wilson was nowhere to be seen. He'd resigned 3 days earlier, claiming health reasons. This special hearing has been called to examine serious allegations of judicial misconduct, the investigator announced. We will hear testimony regarding evidence suppression, abuse of power, and corruption within our court system. The first witness was an elderly court clerk who had worked in the building for 40 years. Her hands trembled as she spoke into the microphone. I saw Judge Blackwell, back when he was just a prosecutor, remove papers from evidence files the night before Michael Carter's trial. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was streamlining the case. The next day, those documents were never mentioned in court. More witnesses followed. A former guard from the prison described how certain inmates were targeted for harassment. A court reporter played recordings she'd secretly made of backroom deals. A forensic accountant traced money from the private prison company through fake businesses and finally into accounts controlled by the judges. Then came Andrew's turn. He walked slowly to the witness stand, feeling everyone's eyes on him. The room fell silent. Tell us in your own words what happened, the investigator said gently. Andrew took a deep breath and began his story, not just about his own case, but about his father, his brother, and all the others who had been chewed up by a system built to profit from their suffering. He spoke clearly, without anger or bitterness, just the simple truth as he knew it. My father wasn't perfect, Andrew said, but he didn't kill anyone. Judge Blackwell knew that. He hid the evidence that would have freed him, just to win a big case and move up in his career. My father died because of that lie. Judge Blackwell's face had gone pale, his usual confidence shattered as document after document confirmed Andrew's words. And when I saw him on the bench that day, Andrew continued, wearing that robe like it made him better than everyone else, something just broke inside me. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. There was no dramatic outburst from the crowd, no shouting or chaos, just a heavy silence as his words sank in. Some people wiped away tears. Others nodded in grim recognition of truths they'd always suspected but never seen confirmed. When Andrew finished, the investigator asked, "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" Andrew looked directly at Judge Blackwell for the first time since that day in court. I used to think the system was broken, he said, but now I understand it was working exactly how some people designed it to work. That's why it needs to be rebuilt, not just fixed. As he returned to his seat, his grandmother squeezed his hand. Outside, the crowds watching on large screens set up on the courthouse lawn broke into applause. The investigation continued for months. Judge Blackwell was removed from the bench and later faced criminal charges. Dozens of his cases were reopened. T was released, his conviction overturned. The private prison company's contracts were cancelled. On the day Andrew's own case was finally dismissed, reporters crowded around him on the courthouse steps. "What will you do now?" someone shouted. Andrew thought about the scholarship offers that had come in, the book deals, the interview requests. "First, I'm going home with my family," he said. "Then I'm going to study law." As cameras flashed around him, Andrew looked up at the courthouse, not with fear or anger, but with determination. One day, he would return to these halls of power, not as a defendant, but as someone with the authority to truly bring justice. His grandmother smiled beside him, her eyes shining with pride and something else, the satisfaction of promises kept and wrongs finally made right.